Right, I'm going to kick off. We've got a good number of you in, and it seems to be kind of slowing down a little bit. So welcome today. Thank you for joining the Nextflow webinar from Secura, all about updates to Nextflow. And today, my name is Phil Ewels. I'm Senior Product Manager for Open Source at Secura, which includes Nextflow. And today I'm also going to be joined by Ben Sherman, Senior Software Engineer at Secura, one of the main developers working on Nextflow, and Paolo Di Tommaso, Chief Architect at Secura, who's obviously the creator of Nextflow. And we've got basically a really nice setup for you today. I'm just going to give you a very quick update about a couple of things at the start, and then Ben's going to do a bit more of a deep dive into some of the new Nextflow language features which we've released, how they work, and why we think you're going to hopefully love them. And then at the end, we've got an extended Q&A section, part of this webinar, where we're going to do an AMA or an Ask Me Anything for Paolo. Well, for the whole team really, but Paolo's going to be there. So if you've got any burning questions about why Nextflow is the way it is, you can get them off your chest. Before we get started, I just want to point out there's a few things here. Firstly, we've got the chat on the side, which is great for doing what we're just doing, just chatting. If you have any questions, please put them into the Q&A tab, which is alongside. That way they don't get lost, and we can keep them nicely organized, and we can also reply to them if we don't have time to reply on screen. People find this really difficult, so this is my challenge to you. See if you can be the first webinar where people actually use the Q&A tab. And then we also run the polls. You've seen one already. We've got a couple more for you as we go through. We really appreciate it if you answer them. Some of them are for fun. There's a couple more at the end, so try and answer those, and that's really appreciated. And if you need to run off at any point or anything, or missed something one of us said, the whole session is being recorded and will be available pretty soon after this webinar wraps up. Okay. So I'm going to kick off with a quick intro, like I say, then Ben's going to talk about language updates, and we'll have Q&A at the end. So the main thing I'm going to mention is the new Nextflow plugins registry, which is not really a feature of Nextflow itself so much, but we did release it alongside Nextflow 2510 in October. And very briefly, what is this, and kind of why is it interesting? If you've ever used Nextflow in the past with plugins, you know you can import them. And what Nextflow does in the background is it went off and it checked this GitHub repository, nextflow.io/plugins. And on this repository, there was simply a JSON file. It's about, I think, 4,500 lines of JSON. And in there is a list of every single Nextflow plugin with every single release, with a URL and a checksum and everything. And that's how Nextflow validated what you put in your import statement, and then knew where to download the plugin from. And this is a very simple setup, and it has served Nextflow very well for the years that it's been working, but it doesn't scale brilliantly. That JSON file gets bigger and bigger and bigger, slower and slower and slower for Nextflow to download at every runtime. And if there are any glitches with that download, then Nextflow can't run. So we've been kind of feeling some growing pains around that for a while, and wanted to see if we could do better. So we've launched the Nextflow plugins registry, which is you can visit now at registry.nextflow.io, where now all Nextflow plugins, past and future, are published there, and you can browse them through your web browser, find them, discover them, which was basically impossible before, see some metadata about them, and Nextflow can access that same registry in a stable and custom-designed API. You can kind of go through, if you can find, for example, Robert's done a plugin here for NF Backtopia for his pipeline. You can see all the different versions there, and like how many times they've been downloaded. And you can go into specific versions, see all the metadata. And we can do some clever stuff with this now that we're running this service ourselves. For example, there's a shiny new button down there saying security scan. And because of how we host the registry service, we can do security scans on every single plugin. One other cool feature we can do is, in the past, if you're using the language server with VS Code, configuration options from plugins were impossible to know about, because Nextflow, the language server, doesn't know about that part of the language. It's extended. And so you'd get a little wiggly yellow line like this at the top saying unrecognized config option. But now we can expose those because the plugin registry knows about plugins and can tell the language server. And so now you get really nice, rich error messages and language help as you develop. So those are just two things that we think that can help with the plugin registry, and we hope that you find it really helpful. Go and check it out at registry.nextflow.io. Okay, with that, I'm going to move on to Nextflow itself. So for the last Nextflow Summit, basically, a couple of months ago, we released the latest Nextflow stable release, 2510. We typically do 2 major stable releases per year for Nextflow, one in April, one in October. And so this version of Nextflow has some key kind of updates. There are improvements in the speed of S3 transfers. If you're interested in that, we've got a great blog post on that on the secure.io with lots of nice technical graphs and things comparing what changed and why it improved things. A couple of new commands, so you can now run authenticate against Secure Platform very easily via the CLI and launch pipelines there directly. Nextflow Run works exactly the same, but if you want to run on platform, you just switch that to Nextflow Launch, just hopefully making that process a little bit easier. But really the 2 killer features and where we put most of our efforts were around these new language syntax features, which were workflow inputs and outputs and static types. And that is what you've all come here to hear about today, I'm sure. And that's what Ben is now going to tell you all about. So with no further ado, I'm going to pass over to Ben and he can tell you all about it. And I'll see you at the Q&A. Ben, thanks for joining.
Hello, everyone. Howdy. Thanks for having me. I'm just going to pull up my screen here because I've got a lot to show you today. So I've prepared a little demo just showing a side-by-side of what these new language features that we've added in Nextflow 2510, what it looks like to use them in practice. I encourage you all to go and watch my my demo at the Nextflow Summit, where I go into a lot more detail about all the specific features and how they work. But I figured for today, it might be nice to just show you a whole example. And I've taken this toy RNA-seq pipeline that we always used and just shown you a before and after of what it looks like to write it sort of idiomatically in 2504 and 2510. So about a year ago, we introduced the Nextflow language server, which we added as an enhancement to the Nextflow VS Code extension. If you're using VS Code, it's very easy to install. You can just go in here and search for the Nextflow extension and just install it. Ignore these. I don't know what these guys are doing, but this is ours. This is the main one. You can install that and it should just work out of the box. If you're using other editors, the community has added support for the language server to a bunch of different editors like NeoVim and Emacs. You can reach out to people in the community like on Nextflow Slack or on the language server GitHub if you are interested in using the language server in other editors, because it should work with most editors. And so we added that, and this was a way to give a much better developer experience when you're writing Nextflow code. The main thing is that you get errors as you're writing code in the editor rather than when you're halfway into a pipeline run and you've already spent however much money running your pipeline, right? And then earlier this year in 2504, we added a lot of that functionality into Nextflow itself. And so we added a new command called Nextflow lint, and you could run that lint command and it would give you the same errors that the language server gives you. And then in 2510 now, we've used that functionality. We're building on that new functionality to now add new features that sort of allow us to evolve beyond just being a Groovy DSL. So now Nextflow is really becoming its own language with its own syntax that has nothing to do with Groovy. And this will allow us to basically build features that are, Nextflow first, rather than having to, deal with Groovy. And so it's a little bit of a transition period that we're in right now, because that new functionality has to be enabled explicitly in 2510. It's called the strict parser or the strict syntax. And so all of these new features, you need to enable that in order to use these features. And then in the next version, 2604, we're going to make that enabled by default. I'll show what that looks like in a moment when I run the pipeline. For now, I just want to walk through some of the code changes and get you guys familiar with what's going on here. So most of you, I assume, are probably familiar with this RNA-seq pipeline, but in case you're not, it's on the Nextflow GitHub. It's just a basic RNA-seq analysis. It takes some FASTQ pairs and it runs FastQC and then Salmon, and then it runs MultiQC on all of that. And so you've got this main workflow here with a couple params for the input samples, the transcriptome, the MultiQC config, and the output directory. And then you've got a little sub workflow here that has all the actual workflow logic that calls all the processes. And then down here, we've got all of the individual processes. The actual pipeline repo has all this stuff split up into modules, but I just put everything in one file here to keep things simple. And so we can see we're using, it's all the standard, sort of Nextflow syntax that you're all used to. And in 2510, the way I would describe it overall is that we've basically overhauled every level of the language to give you more ability to express the structure of the data that you're using. The technical term is static typing. We've added static typing to the language. This allows you to, whenever you're, declaring channels and variables and inputs and outputs, to basically declare the type of those values. And this sort of has two purposes. One is just for the better documentation. It's a lot more informative for a user to see, like, okay, this reads, this is a path. Whereas over here, you can't really see what it is, right? You just know that it defaults to null. But here you see, okay, this is a file. I need to give it a file. So there's better sort of documentation, readability, especially with collaborating with people. And then the other purpose is that it enables better validation. So, with the language server and the strict syntax, we were able to improve a lot of the error checking in that way, because it's a lot stricter about sort of what syntax is allowed. But that was only sort of the first layer of errors, when it comes to like all the different ways that a Nextflow pipeline can go wrong. That's like, there's the first layer, which is like basic syntax parsing errors. And then there's this second layer, which is more like logical errors, or like type mismatch errors, where like you try to like add a number and a string together, or you try to say you think you have a file and you try to call like file.size, but it's actually a string. And so it gives you the length of the string instead of the size of the file. Things like that are kind of hard to catch. And so having the ability to specify types in the language allows Nextflow to catch a lot of those sort of second layer issues. And so let's just walk through a little bit to sort of give you a concrete idea of what's going on here. The first thing that I want to make very clear about all this new syntax that you're going to see is that it's completely optional. And so none of the syntax in this 2504 version will stop working in 2510. I can take this 2504 script, run it in Nextflow 2510, and it'll work just fine as well. All we've done in this phase is just add new syntax, new options. In time, this old syntax may be deprecated and phased out, but we're in no hurry to do that. So don't feel like you need to upgrade immediately. Don't feel rushed. Take your time. Take the time to sort of evaluate these features and how they'll help you, how much time it will take you to migrate, and sort of migrate at your own pace. And we'll make sure to keep the ladder under you as you move up. Okay, so let's start with the params, because this is probably the simple one. There's really not much difference functionally. It's just sort of a different syntax. The main thing that this params block gives you is that now you can specify a type for each input or for each param, whereas you couldn't do that over here on the left. You could specify a default value, but is it a number? Is it a string? Is it a file? You sort of had to just rely on users doing the right thing. For example, you might have a param that's a string that maybe corresponds to like a sample ID, but then at runtime, you give a sample ID that happens to be a number, and Nextflow is trying to be helpful, but it ends up parsing that string as a number, and then that causes other weird errors down the line. And so this just allows you to be much more precise about the types of your parameters. And then Nextflow can also use this type information at runtime so that when you say like, dash dash sample 123, and over here you've defined params.sample to be a string, it will understand, okay, I know it looks like a number, but it's actually declared as a string, so I'll keep it as a string, and problem solve there, okay? When it comes to the workflow logic, there really isn't that much changed. If you compare these two, they're basically the same. We haven't really changed anything about the workflow logic. We are looking into further improvements, but for now, nothing really changed there. One minor thing is that if you were using a onComplete handler or an onError handler, it used to be you had to do it like this. This is sort of like a very groovy, friendly syntax. What we realized was that there was a much nicer way to do it. So we added this new section to the entry workflow called onComplete. So you just say onComplete, and then whatever code you run in there will be run at the end of your pipeline as if you had written this. So again, this still works, but it's just a little bit of a nicer syntax. Another difference you'll notice here is we've got this new publish section, and we've got this output block here. I'm going to come back to that in a second because that's a whole sort of can of worms. What I want to do right now is skip ahead to stay focused on the static types for now, and then we'll come back to the outputs. So here we've got with our sub workflow, again, the workflow logic hasn't really changed at all. The main thing is that now with your takes and your emits, you can specify types. This is especially useful with the takes. It's not as necessary with the emits because the type checker Nextflow can actually infer, the type of your emits like samples and index, as long as you specify the types at the top here. There's sort of a natural flow to it where the type checker will, start with the inputs and then sort of step through your code and figure out, okay, each one of these variables, it will actually figure out what the type of those are. But if you want to specify them on the emits, you can. It can be nice as a sanity check and just for, documentation, like if somebody is hovering over the pipeline, okay, because you wrote out the emits, it can show them all there. Now at this level, the main sort of types that you'll be concerned with are sort of the data flow types like channels and like value channels, as well as, people typically use tuples. So you see all those types here. We've got this reach channel, which is a channel of tuples where each tuple corresponds to some kind of sample, right? And so this is how you would express that in the type system, as you would say it's a channel, and then you use these angle brackets to sort of specify whenever there's some kind of nested type involved. It's like, okay, what's the type of the thing in the channel? Then you would say a tuple, and then a tuple also can sort of contain different things, right? So within that, you would say it's a tuple of string path. What this means is that you've got a sample ID, which is the string, and then the two paths are the FASTQ1 and FASTQ2, so the FASTQ pairs. I'll go ahead and say right out of the gate, I don't really like this syntax because it's very long, but that's just sort of the sort of the nature of the beast of, that's the system that we're currently in. Our focus with these new features was mainly to sort of enable static types for existing code without requiring you to change your pipeline a lot. So we've sort of designed it to meet you where you're at as much as possible. And then in 2604, we're actually looking at adding even more kinds of new features like record types, which may provide a better solution over these long tuple types. So stay tuned for that because that's coming. And so that's really all there is to say about the workflows. It's basically just add types. Take some time to look at the types in the documentation. We've got a page in the Nextflow docs that shows what all the different types are. There's not that many of them. There's like 20 of them, I think. So they're pretty easy to learn. And then go through, and even if you just try adding the annotations for these workflow takes, and then see how far the type checker can go for you. We'll spend some time on the type checker in a second as well. Last piece to show is the processes as far as static types are concerned. So again, mostly hasn't changed. The directives are the same. The script block, the exec block, all that stuff is the same. What has changed are the inputs and outputs. And this is actually a pretty significant piece. And because of this, we've actually, this particular part of, as far as the new language updates go, this new syntax for processes specifically has to be enabled with a feature flag, with a preview flag. So that's why this nextflow.preview.types is up here. You don't need this to use the params block or like the workflow take, like the typed workflow takes or all that. This is purely just if you want to use the process syntax, because we expect that this will likely evolve more in the next version as we add more things like record types. That's likely going to change some things about how we write inputs and outputs at the process level. The main thing here was that processes sort of use this custom mini language for describing the types of your inputs and outputs. We've got this tuple, val, path. Like, you don't really use these anywhere else in the language. It serves a very specific purpose because Nextflow needs to know like how to stage things into the task environment, right? That's the purpose of declaring something as a path instead of a val, is that you're saying this fastq1 is a file that I want you to stage into the task directory when the task runs, right? So we need a way to sort of preserve that behavior. And we found a way to basically do this, but using a syntax that's sort of more consistent with the rest of the language. And so what you see here is the inputs here, or also the inputs here. It's structured in a very similar way to what we saw up here with the workflow takes, where it's just you give a name, and then you do the colon, and then you give a type. It's just that in the process, there's a little bit of extra bells and whistles going on here. So first of all, as you can see here, we've got this ability to like break out a tuple in the same way we had this tuple here. You can't, this syntax doesn't exist at any other level of the language, but it basically allows you to say, okay, I need a tuple. The tuple has 3 things in it. I want to just pull those out, and here are their names. Their names are ID, fastq1, and fastq2. And then over here in this tuple, it's the same sort of tuple type that we saw up here in the workflow. We're able to specify, and we see it's the same sort of string path. And so those types are used by Nextflow to figure out which things are files, right? And so Nextflow can look at this and say, okay, I see fastq1 is a file, fastq2 is a file, so I'm going to stage them in exactly the same way as if using this little path qualifier. So it's pretty one-to-one in terms of like what the syntax is. Basically everything that you could do in this old syntax still works in the new syntax, with the exception of one thing, which is the each qualifier. If you're using each, you're going to have to, and there's workarounds, but you're going to have to do that a different way. Now on the outputs, I really like the way the outputs work here, because this can basically be whatever you want. It can be any sort of value. In this case, we're creating a tuple. We're just calling the standard sort of tuple function that you also use in workflows. And then if you want a file, you call the file function and it gives you a file. You can also call the files function. If say you want to grab a glob pattern, then you would say, you could do something like this, and that's going to say, okay, give me all the files matching that glob pattern. This is one important change from the previous syntax, because this path qualifier on the output had no way to distinguish between a single file and a collection of files. And so you see this a lot in NF Core. I'm sure many of you have dealt with this, where you think you have a file, and then actually it actually turns out to be a list of files, or maybe you think you have a list of files, but it's actually just one file, and you try to call some method on it, and then it fails in some weird way, right? So now you can be much more precise about that by using either file or files. Much the same way as you can call the file function up here in the workflow, like you see here. And if you want to have multiple outputs, you can also do that. I think all of the processes here happen to only have one output, so we didn't do that. But let's say that we wanted to, name this something. Instead of doing the emit option over here, you just assign it. So we'll just say like something like result equals whatever, and that does the same thing that the emit option did for you before. So again, essentially the same syntax that you see at the workflow level. And then if you want to specify a type, you can do that as well. So I could go in here and, specifically say like, okay, this is a tuple of string path. Okay. So that's, a crash course in, what the new type syntax looks like. I think you should see some links popping in the chat. We've written a lot of documentation on, how these types work and how to migrate, an existing pipeline to a new pipeline, how to like reason about the types and all of that. So I encourage you all to go to the docs if you to learn more about this. And in fact, with the types, we can actually we've provided a little something special just for you guys, which is the language server has this custom command which can automatically convert existing code to this new static type syntax. And so if you go into the command palette, this is specifically in VS Code, and you look for convert script to static types. This was at the top because I just tested it before I came on here. We can run that, and I've just run that on the 2504 code on the left, and we can see how the language server has just updated our code, not to exactly match what we have on the right, but it's done a lot of the sort of grunt work for us. The first thing that it's done is, because I had a Nextflow schema JSON over on the side here, it's taken that and combined it with the old param assignments we had there, and it's generated a new params block, which you can see is pretty close to what we have on the right. And then also it has updated all of the processes to the new syntax. And then it's also added this little preview flag for you, just so that it's clear that you're stepping into a preview feature. And so I've tested this on a lot of different pipelines, a lot of different NF core pipelines especially, and it's working pretty well. I will probably try to keep expanding on it as I can. Like one thing that it doesn't do right now is the takes and the emits. So you still have to add those manually. But consider that a good exercise for you to learn about the type system. Or you just wait and maybe I'll just figure out how to automate that as well. So that's a little goodie. Try that out. I definitely encourage trying that before trying to migrate a huge like 100 module pipeline by hand, because I can tell you I've tried it. It's very repetitive. Just use the magic button. If you run into issues, let me know and I will try to fix it, because I do not want you guys to have to be updating code manually. So we've tried to automate it as much as we can. Now, the other thing I wanted to show here was the new workflow output syntax. How much time? I think we have maybe 5 or 10 more minutes. So I'll try not to take too much longer here. On the left here, we've got 2504, and you can see we're using the publish dir for, to publish the outputs of all these processes. And even this one, this is a pretty simple pipeline, so it's not really taking up that much space. It's pretty simple, just one little publish dir line. But if I'm sure for many of you, if you've worked on more complex pipelines, you're probably more familiar with, putting this in the config and having these massive config blocks of publish dir statements, and you're like wrapping them in like process selectors, and you're like specifying the publish mode like over and over and over. But also, and so that's just sort of annoying syntactically, but also at a higher level, this publish dir approach is it's a very sort of DSL1 way of doing things, where everything was all in one script and sort of the processes were the center of everything. You're defining your top level pipeline outputs at the process level, and you're just sort of grabbing file globs to say like, okay, just grab all the star.bams or star.bais and publish those. You're saving them to an output directory. It's very difficult to see from this pipeline like what the expected structure of the pipeline outputs are. You kind of just have to run the pipeline and see what it spits out. and hope that maybe you caught all the cases to even get a good sense of what all is there. And so what we've done in 2510 is, and if you've been following along, you may already, we've been sort of hinting at this for several releases now, this output block. It's been in preview for, I think, 3 releases before this one. We finally made it stable. If you've been, playing with this in preview mode, so if you've been especially if you were doing it in 2504, it's basically the same as what the preview version was from 2504. The only difference is you just have to remove that old preview flag, just from the nextflow.preview.output. You don't need that anymore. So just remove that, and then it should basically work out of the box. But what this does is it's sort of almost like a DSL2 data flow centric way to think about outputs and publish outputs. Rather than trying to like pull file globs out of individual processes and hope that everything lands in the right spot, you just publish channels. So we just take the output channel of, say, FastQC, and so where does that come in? That comes in right here. And then that gets passed along, it gets joined in with the quant results to this samples channel. And then up here, this samples channel, we publish it under this new publish section. So we just say samples equals samples.channel. I'm doing a little bit of data flow logic here just to convert the tuple into a map, because that has some nice benefits down here. And then in the output block, we're declaring this samples output in 2510. So this is the one new thing. You can also specify a type for the output. Again, it's not necessary. It's more just if you want it for documentation. And then there's 2 things that you have to do. One is you use the path directive to define the directory structure that you want. And so in here we can say, okay, every sample that's coming in from this channel, I want to take the FastQC results and put them in the FastQC folder, and then the quant results, put them in the quant folder. And so already we can get a pretty good gist here of like what the directory structure is going to look like. And the other piece is this index file, which you can use to, basically what this does is it takes your channel and it writes it to a file, like a JSON version of your channel. In this case, I'm writing to JSON. You can also do CSV. That'll basically give you like a traditional sample sheet, right? I personally prefer JSON just because it's a little bit more precise, but either one works. And so this allows you to basically get a sample sheet for free from your channel. And then that's a sample sheet that you could just pipe directly into some downstream process, right? And so this is a bit more of a higher level like paradigm shift. Unfortunately, it's not as easy to automate. Although I promise if I can find a way to automate it, I will give it a try. But for now, at least, this is mainly something that needs to be done manually. Sakara AI might be able to help with this because you've got to think about like, okay, what were the outputs that you were trying to capture in this process? And then, follow the output channel through your workflow logic and then make sure that they're being published up here in the same way. And then what you get from doing all of this, the static types and the workflow outputs, is that you get a pipeline that is just a lot more robust and a lot more readable, right? So now we've got this, first of all, we've got this nice little trio here of the params, the entry workflow, and the output. So this sort of forms a unit. This is like the definition of a pipeline: inputs, data flow, output. And we're going to continue to build on this to provide additional tooling. Think about things like the Nextflow schema, like representing the outputs in this schema as well as the inputs. And that's just going to help with a lot of things. Any sort of automation or AI agent that wants to work with a pipeline is going to have a much easier time when you have this sort of clear definition of the inputs and the outputs. And if you want to think about things like pipeline chaining, like how to map outputs of pipeline A to the inputs of pipeline B, that's a lot easier now because there's a nice sort of parallel structure between the params and the outputs, right? They're just a list of named things. All their structures are defined. And so I know that's a lot to take in, but like I said, we've written a ton of documentation on this topic, and we're going to continue to try and discuss openly and communicate like what things are coming down the pipe. But we hope that this sort of first foray into static types and the workflow inputs and outputs will sort of we believe is going to put us on the path to having, very, very readable and robust Nextflow code. Now, these examples aren't set up to be like totally executable. I just sort of pulled out the code. But if you want to try them out, what you can do is say Nextflow run RNA-seq-rf, and then you can set the revision to preview-25.10. This is also in one of the migration guides that I showed. Except, hold on, there's one more thing you got to do. Okay, if you run this just out of the box, you're going to get some kind of weird error because these new features rely on the strict syntax, right? And so it doesn't know about things like the incomplete section. So what you want to do first is set export NSF syntax parser to V2. That will enable the strict syntax. This is just for 2510. In 2604, this will happen by default, so you won't have to worry about it then. So this is just if you want to try this out in 2510, and then let's give it a try. And I just ran this, so it should work just fine. You should see it run just the same way. Oh, okay, I forgot. What I forgot was to use a profile to provide the software dependencies. So we're going to do dash profile. We're going to run it with Conda. And there it goes. And we can go over here and see this results directory being created. And we can see that the results directory lines up with what we specified here in the output block. We've got the fastqc folder, the quant folder, and then we've also split them out so each sample is in its own subdirectory. So this sample was called gut, and then the multi-QC report. I am basically out of time, but there was one more. If there was one more thing I was going to show is the actual type checking. If you want to enable that, that's an extension setting here in the settings. Just look up type checking. You can enable that, and then you can go in here and you will start to see more kinds of errors around type checking. And also when you hover over things, you're going to start to see a lot more information about types. I've already went into a lot of that detail in the Summit talk. So definitely check that out if you want to see playing with the type checker a bit more. All right, well, I think that's all I've got, but I want to hand it off to the next person.
All right, brilliant stuff. Thank you, Ben. Just before I bring Paolo on, I thought I'd just start with a couple of questions for you specifically about the things we were just talking about, because we had a few questions come in, and then we can have a more general kind of Q&A after that. And there's one thing I wanted to say as well, which is to kind of preface this whole body of work and say that we know that changing a syntax for Nextflow language is such a delicate thing. And we're so sensitive to the fact that we know that, people will have to update their pipelines when we do this. And this work really comes on the back of like 2 years at least of kind of planning, of doing Nextflow surveys and seeing what people wanted and what asked. And every time we did a survey, for as long as I can remember, 2020 and before, it always came up the same. We need better error messages. We need to make it easier to debug things when they go wrong. We need to make it easier to sort of track and have more guardrails. And so that's why we're doing this now. It's not kind of just because we think it's cool and it's the hot thing to do right now. We're trying to react to what the community's been asking for years, and that's kind of where these new language syntax features are coming from.
Absolutely.
I was going to get you to reiterate some of the opt-in stuff, but you actually did it again just at the end, so I don't think I need to say that too much. But I think that's really important. If you just upgrade Nextflow and try out this new syntax, when it will break, you need to have that environment variable to use that. And then if you're going to do the type processes, you need the preview flag. Ben, you said that if people had trouble, they should tell you about it and reach out for help, but you didn't tell them where or how.
Well, the easiest place is to just make a GitHub issue if you find something that you think is a bug. I pay pretty close attention to those. You can also go to the Nextflow Slack if you want to do something more informal, or if you're not sure if it's an issue or like something that you're doing wrong. There's a couple different channels. Like you can always just go to the help channel if you're not sure. There's also a channel called Nextflow Syntax. And then there's also a channel called VS Code Extension if you're dealing with something more like VS Code related. So just any of those channels. I mean, I watch all of them, and I try to come in and help as soon as I can. And also there's a lot of good just Nextflow experts in that Slack that will also help you out.
And there's a forum as well, community.sakira.io.
Yes, we watch that as well. So any one of those, whatever you like, just pick one, and we'll keep an eye out.
Okay, like 2 more questions, and then I'll take it on. Type aliases, are they supported or are they coming?
Type aliases, well, that's kind of a vague term. There are ideas related to that. Like one is record types, which is sort of a replacement for tuples. We're also looking at ideas around, like you probably saw the path type a lot in that code. We're looking at maybe having some way to have something more specific than that, because usually you know that it's going to be like a FASTQ file or BAM file or text file, whatever. So maybe having some kind of alias for that, just so that you can have a little bit more validation. That's what I would keep an eye out for.
Got a question here. I think you touched on it, but it's good to reiterate. Can I mix the two, static typing and the old style, all within one workflow?
For the most part, I think the only restriction is that the typed processes, when it comes to the process syntax, it needs to be all or nothing there within a single script. So you can't have like an old process and a new process in the same script. You can have both in the same pipeline, just as long as they're separated. So, you think about it, if you have a pipeline with a bunch of modules, you can update one module at a time if you want. You don't have to like update all of them at once, because if they're all separated into separate files. That's sort of how we drew the line there.
And then I've got one here, which I'll take, because I saw it come in, and it's about AI, and I went and asked Sasha and the AI team it live while the webinar's going. The question was, if I use Sakira AI now, will I get the old or the new features in the code that it generates? And the answer is a little bit like probably a mixture right now, but it should be better than if you use like a vanilla LLM. Like the big major providers will still be going on what they know, which is the old syntax. Sakira AI knows about the Nextflow docs, and the Nextflow docs, I don't know, Ben, what would you say? They're like 50% over to the new syntax now or something?
Yeah, something like that.
So I would expect Sakira AI to be about 50% over to the new syntax, and that will get better quite quickly over the coming months as we upgrade more and more of the Nextflow docs to use a new syntax. So hopefully that will really help a lot, and especially if you push it further in that direction, it will do it, and it will know what you're talking about. Okay, I'm going to bring Paolo on now, if that's okay, or Paolo can bring himself on, and we'll move on to the Ask Me Anything.
Hi, Ben.
Thanks for joining,
Hey.
Paolo. Got my team together. The team's bigger in this, but good to have you on. Right, so folks in the audience, put in your questions now. I'll be watching, and I'm going to pick out a few to ask. And Paolo, I'm going to kick off one we've got for you here, which is I guess related to one that's kind of related to the new syntax we're talking. The DSL2 transition was a significant shift for the community, and what was the hardest part of introducing such a fundamental change whilst maintaining backwards compatibility, and how do we avoid that kind of pain as we do new syntax now?
Yeah, like you were mentioning before, changing the language is always something a bit difficult. Don't say dramatic, but it's an important change. So first of all, a lot of thinking what we are bringing, why we are doing, what the value that we are adding, bringing this new feature. Especially in DSL2 was a radical change, but at the same time, I think the guidelines and the North Star was, okay, we decided to make this big change to allow Nextflow to be more modular. I always resisted a lot of time to avoid that, but at some point it was clear that that was something really important to make the language, the runtime, the workflow engine to grow, to go to the next level, to allow the people to write much bigger, much complex workflow. And so it was a necessary step to be done. And the point was, okay, let's do a new, completely different syntax, but keeping the same model. I think that was the guideline, the North Star of this change. So embracing a different syntax that allow Nextflow developer to define modules to isolate processes, but not breaking the contract, or let's say better, not breaking the core model on Nextflow that is about data flow, about parallelism. So the paradigm is exactly the same with a different syntax. And that was the main idea. Essentially, if you get that is just a different way to wire the task and the processes in your workflow, but the programming model is exactly the same, the transition is very simple.
Nice. You kind of led me on to the question I was eyeing up next as well, which if you go back further, what was the original problem that you were trying to solve when you started building Nextflow?
Sure, yeah. Well, the original problem at the end didn't change much over the time. The original problem was to enable people to write portable code in different infrastructure, especially in a scalable manner. And more practically, when I was in Notre Dame Lab, Center for Genome Regulation, the practical problem was essentially to write a pipeline for scaling and comparing protein sequence alignment tools in different data sets. And the idea was, okay, we want to compare different tools from protein alignment across different data. So the essentially problem was to replicate the same task with different data sets. Classic benchmark problem. And I realized there was not a simple way, something that apparently should be trivial. There was not a simple way to manage the scalability, to manage the error recovery, to manage to maybe prototype my computer and then launch efficiently into Amazon Cloud. So I started to brainstorm what it could be done, and then what it became Nextflow, essentially. This was the concrete specific problem application, and then more in general, enable the scalability, the portability of pipelines using this approach.
Very nice. And when you think back to those early stages, is there any kind of design or architecture decisions that you made in those kind of early days? Was it 2015? Was it when you started something like that?
Well, no, before 2013.
Yeah, making us feel old.
Time passed.
Is there any kind of design or architecture decisions that you're proud of, and is there any that you do differently if you were starting a project today?
Well, I don't know if proud, but I think some good design choice was this idea to isolate each task into its own directory. This is something that is, I think, still unique somehow to Nextflow. I think we can say that it was a good decision because it allowed us to parallelize in a much simpler way many tasks, and also when there is some failure, it's much simpler to debug failure in the pipeline execution. And also surely also the idea to isolate task execution in container. That time was something really new. I think also Docker came out around 2013. I remember there was a lot of skepticism. There was some resistance. Oh no, it should not be done. Too new. It's too beta. Make not much sense. And so then become really the way to deploy computation, and not just bioinformatics, also general computation into the cloud, and not only the cloud. So that was definitely a good decision, good approach, and we are still benefiting from this, all the community.
Thinking about similar kind of technology changes, I mean, the obvious one happening now is AI and code generation. How do you see AI-driven code generation influencing workflow development? And do you have any kind of best practices, or can you think of any kind of guardrails that you'd recommend for teams using AI assistants with Nextflow?
Well, definitely, we are in a new paradigm shifting into software engineering. I think this is comparable to something that happened when there was introduction of the cloud. Well, even more, I think it's a huge change that there is in software industry. And so this is impacting everybody. I think for Nextflow, it's not really different from general programming and software development. I think all of us, I'm the first one, I'm using more and more AI agent my daily work, and developing Nextflow code. I don't think is much different developing any other programming with any other programming language, Python, Go, whatever, Java, etc. So guidelines, what I see that is benefiting focus on clear goal when you use your agent, define proper context, and also is very useful planning before executing. When you define exactly what you want to do with the agent, it dramatically help the experience. And also with Nextflow, it's the same. Instead of say, oh, generate this huge pipeline, you can guide the agent in a much more precise manner. You might say, I want to implement this task, I have trouble with this task, help me debugging. So providing very narrow instruction helps a lot the agent and helps a lot the experience. Pretty sure that Nextflow is identical.
I'd agree with that. I think nice comment in the chat from Austin as well, that adding typing to the language is also a good step to help agentic.
Yeah, definitely. This is also one decision to embrace the typing was exactly this, to make the agent much more, to provide much more metadata about the language, about the type, about the structure to the agent level, so it can have much better guidance for the code composition.
And whenever I'm working with AI code generation, I always find that the best practices for LLMs tend to be also just good practices for people as well. It's like, write things in a clear way.
Totally. Yeah, this is incredibly, really surprising. That is just accelerating the natural behavior.
I'm going to pick off a couple of questions that are coming in about more the technical syntax changes, if that's okay, because I don't want to run out of time and miss them. Ben or Paolo, either. There's a question here about Ben, you mentioned the deprecation of the each utility. And can you talk a little bit about why that's not part of a new syntax, each, and why we've deprecated it, and what people can do about that if they're using that at the moment?
Yeah, something to understand. Yeah, something to understand, more at a higher level is that the trend of the language has been taking these process definitions, these modules, and making them as standalone as possible. In DSL1, they were like all tangled up in the workflow logic, right? You got the from and the into. In DSL2, they're more isolated, but you still have certain things like each or when that sort of couple the process to workflow logic. And we want modules to be like very standalone, so that even in the future, maybe they could be executed on their own, or used by the AI on their own. And so the each is one of those things that it sort of implies some kind of workflow logic. I really like it. We all love it. It's a really nice shorthand, but there's just not really a good way to represent it in this model where the inputs and outputs are like just a standalone thing. So what you have to do instead is what that each is doing under the hood is that it's sort of taking two inputs and combining them, like getting the combinations, like maybe you have it each for like 3 different methods you want to use. And so you want to repeat it for each method. You can do the same thing in the workflow definition by using something like the combine operator, where you take 2 channels and it will just give you all the combinations of those channels. And so you just do that, and then you'll get some kind of combined tuple, and then you would pass that into the process instead as a single input.
Talking a little bit about config, we're moving away from published here as well. That's another thing we're kind of deprecating. But with the new output syntax, will you still be able to configure whether files are published or not from a config file without editing the pipeline source code? So, for example, if I have an NF core pipeline, can I kind of turn off certain publishing?
Yeah, I think originally I didn't add it, and then I think Paolo added it under the hood while I wasn't looking. So you have him to thank. But yes, you do have the ability to enable or disable workflow outputs at large. Also in the script, you can enable specific outputs. You can like enable or disable them. If you want to control it through the config, what I recommend is that you use a parameter, because params can also be used in the output block, just like the workflow. And so you can have a parameter to say you toggle this input or that output or whatever. And then in your output block, you can say, enabled, and then pass that parameter in. And that's the way to give the user control of that kind of stuff at runtime.
On the topic of configs, and maybe Paolo, you can comment on this one. Jason says that his team is often confused about configuration. It's like so powerful, you can basically have any kind of groovy code in your config file. And is there any thoughts about what can be done about the config system and kind of typing and the new language and syntax passes here?
Yeah, this is something that we are planning to somehow improve with the new releases next. So maybe this is one point that I may regret, linking to the previous question that you were doing. So essentially, there is too many things that can be done in Nextflow config. What we want to achieve to a much more declarative configuration experience. Now, essentially, Nextflow configuration file is essentially groovy Java code under the hood. You can use any programming statement into the Nextflow configuration. That tend to make too many magic things into the configuration file. It's powerful, but at the same time, can create too many complex or hard things to maintain. So ideally, what we are looking into to make much more control the configuration file, to have essentially a declarative configuration file, which you cannot use if, or you cannot use for, or try catch, much more similar to any other programming environment configuration file.
Yeah. The thing that reminds me of this conversation is, in the Python world, we've had setup.py to install packages for a long time, which is just a Python script, but that community has moved away to pyproject.toml, which is kind of the same kind of declarative. I think many similar processes. Okay, we are at time, so I need to restrain myself and stop asking questions, which is a shame because I'm having fun. A lot of good questions here, but we need to wrap up. So thank you, Ben and Paolo, for joining me today. Thank you, everyone who's listening and held on to the end. We're going to put up a poll in a second, so please just take 30 seconds to fill that in. Tell us what you think of the webinar and what you'd like to see in the future, and we'll do our best to listen. And yeah, if you have any questions, please try out a new syntax, try and break it, try and find all the edge cases you've thought up which don't work, and then tell us about it, because now is the time, and we can try and help you out. Great stuff. Thanks very much, everyone.
Goodbye.